So he was most decidedly not identified as a Reformed Jew. And so here he was, you know, a more traditional Jew, but who was still advocating certain things that weren't happening in the more traditional Jewish community.
The first proposal, okay, the second was to institute the bat mitzvah ceremony. And the third was a decision to call the women's organization the women's division rather than the sisterhood.
That doesn't seem like a hugely radical, it's interesting that that was like,
I like that myself, the women's
We don't-
sisterhood.
yeah,
What is it?
I never heard
We have a
of this
women's
stuff.
group.
right, and the women's division, I don't know, it sounds almost like
Military.
like a military or a company, it's interesting, but
So
anyway.
cabinet level.
Cabinet level, right, right. So those were among his first three interests in terms of when he started off on this with this new community of people who were supporters, who really wanted to go with him on this path of modernizing Jewish life.
The Jewish Center, just geography.
Yes.
The Jewish Center, Eric, the Jewish Center is where? Because the.
There is a Jewish center on West 86th Street
Yeah, and then
that
there's the
Lamb
SAG.
was the rabbi of, and he's the president of Yeshiva University.
Norman Lamb was
Yeah.
the rabbi of the Jewish
And
Center.
that's sort of in the middle of
Well, that's
it,
probably-
between Amsterdam and
Yeah.
Columbus, and the Society for what we called
The prevention.
the Prevention of Judaism,
Don't get into that.
had personal experience with the then rabbi,
Yeah.
was on the corner of 86th Street and Central Park West.
Okay. Okay.
And that, I think, is maybe the split they're talking about when he sort of moved his people out.
I think
a
that's
block and a half
probably
away.
right, because the Jewish Center was an Orthodox institution and remained so after he left, and it wouldn't surprise me if it's the very same one that Norman Lamb was serving. And yeah. So
They just moved down the block.
they just moved down the block.
Okay.
So
It's very traditional, by the way, you split and move down the block.
yeah, right. So he talks at the bottom of the next paragraph. We're not going to read it, but you know, he had one innovation that he did without consulting anyone. He changed some language in the service that talked about the rebuilding of the temple, but he never told anybody he was going to do it, and no one ever gave him any flack for it. But he has this, you know, people have other things on their mind when the cantor is chanting the Amidah. So you know, people weren't really paying attention to what was going on, so no one gave him any resistance. But then there came the mixed seating. So, Sue, would you like to?
Oh, we're back.
Back to you.
Okay. Mixed seating, however, was quite another story. When it came to another more visible change, he explained, there was protest, and the protesters have had their way. I wanted that men and women should not be divided off, as is done in Orthodox synagogues. I believe there is no reasonable excuse for continuing the custom of separating the sexes during prayer, now that men and women sit promiscuously
Yeah.
at all other functions, social and educational. At this point, Kaplan gave in to the organizers who were afraid that mixed seating might identify them
Okay.
as
As Reformed Jews, I'm sorry, yeah, but that was only happening in the Reform world at that point, and you know, chas v'shalom, you know, heaven forbid, people should think that we were Reformed, you know, that they were Reformed Jews, so we are not going to go for this mixed seating thing. Okay, go ahead.
By May of 1922, however, Kaplan succeeded in convincing the trustees to allow mixed seating at the upcoming high holidays. Nonetheless, he was skeptical about their motivation and wondered whether their capitulation was due to their own realization that it was absurd to maintain a custom that was so out of keeping with the attitude assumed toward women today, and that it is so much a hindrance to active participation in the prayer on the part of every member of the family, or whether it was because another well-known rabbi who was always regarded as orthodox had taken the pulpit in a neighborhood synagogue that had abolished separate seating.
Ah.
So who was the rabbi?
I don't know. That's a good question.
Must have been competition.
Right, right. So, Kaplan,
But that's the boy, who might have impure motives, right?
well, that's right.
Not it.
He never, right, no, he was very clear about what he wanted, and apparently he'd been pushing for it for a while before he had agreement from the board that they could go ahead and.
I love it.
So, isn't that, but yeah, you get a kind of an interesting insight into the process of the conversation. So, all right, let's flip to 350.
Oh, it's
Oh,
also,
yeah.
it's just the next one.
Yeah.
It said, as a result of the wives sitting with their husbands and children, I succeeded in doing away with continual conversation and interest in the service.
Right.
Which is certainly what I remember from my child, was the memory of somebody constantly pounding for shush.
But, and there was mixed seating and
No.
no?
It's not for-
Okay, all right, so,
Was it
right.
on both sides of the conversation, both sides of the division?
She went, I don't remember. I don't
Because
remember.
all the little kids are hanging on the
Yeah.
women,
Yeah.
so they can't dominate anything.
Right.
So, right, no, so he was right, he thought it was very successful, not just on a philosophical level, but pragmatically, the service went more smoothly once there was integrated seating. So, okay. So let's go to, he does tell a little interesting story about his mother-in-law, but let's, we're gonna skip down on 350, to the middle of that page about, I'm gonna say a little bit about bat mitzvah.
If the question of mixed seating caused such a commotion, the introduction of bat mitzvah appears to have occurred with little congregational opposition. Of the now celebrated first bat mitzvah of the SAJ, Kaplan made only the following cursory entry. Last Sabbath, March 19th, I inaugurated the ceremony of the bat mitzvah at the SAJ Meeting House, 41 West
West 86, that's,
Oh,
about which more details later.
Mhm.
My daughter Judith was the first one to have her bat mitzvah celebrated there. There are, however, no further questions recorded, although Judith Kaplan Eisenstein herself recalls with amusement that the night before the event, both of her grandmothers sat in her bedroom, rocking back and forth. Her grandmother Kaplan, she vividly recalls, said, Okay. Tell your daughter-in-law not to do it. Machatenister, replied the other. Tell your son not to do it. It was indeed a greater to-do, at least within the family, than father records in his diary.
I just love that
I
story.
know.
You picture
I know.
the mother and the mother-in-law,
I
like,
know.
they're just going nuts about what he's gonna do,
the
right.
better part of wisdom is he doesn't say anything in his diary, you see.
But I bet, what I'm sure that reflects is that they never actually had a conversation with him because they knew that he was, this was gonna lead to a huge fight, and he was bound and determined to do it, and so they were with each other, kind of consoling each other about the fact that this relation of theirs was gonna do something that to them was Jewishly, not a good thing, and that he was gonna become famous for it, and they were, they weren't happy with that.
And they were ready to lay blame at the foot of the other one.
Right. Right, because his mother
Yeah,
knew
your son-in-law.
that she couldn't talk to him because he would not stand to talk to her because they had their dynamic. But the mother-in-law knew that she was in no position to go and try to get him to stop. Anyway, it was just I've never heard that story before. I think it's a great story.
My question,
Yeah.
did he write any responsive or anything about this, or is it just because?
So okay, right. So back to your question. So I am not aware that he ever took the step of writing a response. And I think in his mind, I think it was that this just made sense. This was where the world was headed, and it made sense, and it would be strange and unnatural to not celebrate a girl's coming of age, in a way parallel to how you would celebrate a boy's coming of age.
That was really a big break with the conservative movement as well as the Orthodox movement. to approach decision-making in that way.
Right, although I don't know at that point if the conservative movement had instituted something like they have today, like the Committee of Laws and Standards, that does think through everything from a halakhic point of view and justifies it. Yeah.
Is the bar mitzvah in the Torah? I mean, is it
No.
Is
No,
it in the Talmud?
No.
No.
It's a well, it is. There's the phrase is in the Talmud,
Okay.
but it simply in the Talmud means
Mhm.
that you are of age
Right.
to be considered responsible for your behavior.
Okay.
So, and as a ceremony, it's really a medieval.
Okay.
It's a medieval creation. So by Jewish standards, it's relatively new.
Recent.
Right. But you know, it had been around for whatever 800 years. At that 700 or 800 years, and in various forms. It used to be actually in the early Middle Ages that boys would come up, younger than 13, would come up and read from the Torah and read the Haftarah, and there's a whole book that explains the